So for today, we are talking about squares and square roots. And this is just a really helpful table. If you think that you might want this, you can take a picture of it and print it off or whatever. But it just shows you that 1 squared, remember the exponent tells you how many times to do something. So that says multiply 1 twice. So 1 times 1, which equals 1. 2 squared, that means you have 2 2's. So 2 times 2 is 4. 3 squared means you have 2 3's. 3 times 3 is 9. We could keep going through this over and over. We're not going to, but those are your squares. And then your square roots. When you take the square root of something, you're asking yourself what times what equals that number. So for example, if we just look at the square root of 25, we're asking ourselves what number times or what number equals 25, and it has to be the same number times the same number, which ends up being 5 times 5, or -5 times -5. Both of those equal a positive 25. So when we do a square root, remember it's the opposite of squaring. So when you square something, you say 5 times 5 equals 25. When you take the square root, you ask yourself what times what equals that. So we're going in reverse. And notice for every square root, there is a positive and a negative answer. Like the square root of 100, positive 10 works because 10 times 10 equals 100, and negative 10 works because negative 10 times negative 10 also equals positive 100. A negative times a negative is a positive. So every square root has 2 answers. It has a positive answer and a negative answer. Now, a lot of times in real world situations, when you solve a real world problem, you won't need both answers. Like, for example, when we start doing Pythagorean theorem and we're finding the length of a side, you can't have something that's -5 inches long. You can't have a negative length. So a lot of times when we take square roots, we only put the positive answer, but you do have to understand that for every square root, there is a positive and negative answer. Okay, so this one says find all the possible square roots. The first one is 324. Now, hopefully y'all know by now that I always use my calculator, right? So let me pull over my calculator, and I'm going to type in the square root. This is your square root symbol here of 324. Now the calculator tells you positive 18, but you have to know, you have to remember that it could be positive 18 or it could be negative 18. So whatever answer you get, just remember it could be the positive answer or the negative answer, because 18 times 18 equals 324, and negative 18 times negative 18 also equals 324. So both of those are our solutions. And just as an FYI, a lot of times you'll see this written as plus or minus. I don't know why that didn't change colors. That was weird. Sometimes you'll see this where you see a plus or minus 18. That means both answers. That means the positive 18 and that means the negative 18. All right, so now let's look at the square root of 2.25. So square root 2.25, that equals 1.5. But just remember, if you get a positive, you know it also has to equal the negative. So this equals positive 1.5 or negative 1.5. And another way that you could write that is plus or minus 1.5. All right, estimate the value of negative square root of 79 to the nearest integer. Okay, so you guys have 2 options here. In the Connexus lesson, they teach you the method of using perfect squares to estimate. That's great. If you ask yourself, what's the closest perfect square to that? You'll probably come up with the square root of 81, which is 9. It's a little bit less than 9, but 9 is probably the closest. If we look at what it's between the square root of 64, which is 8, and the square root of 81, which is 9. So this has to be a number somewhere between 8 and 9. So that's how they teach you to do it in the Connexus lesson. But I want you to also be confident just using a calculator. So the square root of 79 equals 8.88819 blah, blah, blah. And it says to estimate to the nearest tenth. So this would be 8.9. Or to the nearest integer, I'm sorry, then this would be 9. Because an integer does not have a decimal. So we would say the closest integer would be 9. Now I forgot, oh geez, I'm so glad I forgot this. Y'all don't forget this. There's a negative hanging on the outside, so we got to make sure we get that negative in our answer. All right, Weeman makes a square quilt that has an area of 100 square inches. It has 25 square blocks with the same size. What is the length of each side of a block? Okay, I like to visualize this. So I went ahead and drew it up here. What I did is I did a 5 by 5 because that gives me 25. So I have 5 on this side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I have 5 on this side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 5 times 5 is 25 blocks. I'm not going to go through and label all 25 of those, but just so you know, that's 25 blocks. We know that the entire area, the whole thing, is 100. And we also know that area equals of a square is length times width, but since it's a square, it's the same number. So the area equals, you can just call it the length squared or x squared, however you want to call that. And we know that the area of the big thing equals 100. So if I want to know the side length of the full quilt, which is not exactly what it asked, but I need to find that first, I would want to get x by itself. So I would square root this and square root that because squares and square roots cancel. And I would get x equals plus or minus 10, but it doesn't make sense to have a negative distance. So I know that, oh geez, that was a terrible line. Let me undo that. I know that this side here, this length, that whole thing is 10 units long. And I know this whole length down here is 10 units long because to find the area, 10 times 10 equals 100. Okay, but that's not what it asks for. It says, what is the length of the side of one of these blocks? All right, so we have 25 square blocks. I already drew them up here. If we know that this whole side has to be 10, then we know that this has to be 2, 2, 2. Like each of these little pieces have to be 2 because if you add those all together, 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 10. Or you could just go over here and say that this whole thing is 10, but I want to divide it into 5 pieces, which would equal 2. So each side of one of these would be 2 units long. And I think that's actually what we were trying to answer. What is the length of each side of the block? Yep. So each side of the blocks would be 2 units long. What is the value of x if 15 squared equals x? Okay, well remember when we solve equations, we always try to get the x by itself? Well, guess what? The x is already by itself. So all we have to do is simplify this. And you can either do it in your brain or your calculator. Y'all know me, I'm going to do it in my calculator. 15 squared equals 225. So I'm just going to write that over here. 15 squared is 225. And so that equals x. That would be my answer. All right, I hope this helps. Good luck on your quick check.